Both attorneys delivered their closing arguments to the jury. Following the defense counsel's closing argument, the prosecution described Dahmer as a sane man in full control of his actions, who killed to control his victims and retained their bodies to give himself a prolonged period of sexual pleasure. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, born May 21st, 1960, was an American serial killer who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Most of these acts of incredible depravity involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and the perverted preservation of severed body parts. Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978, 3 weeks after his high school graduation. On June 18th, he picked up a teenager hitchhiker, Billy Smithers. Dahmer lured the youth to his house with the pretext of drinking a few beers. Dahmer bludgeoned the young man with a 10-pound dumbbell. The following day, Dahmer dissected Billy's body in his parents' basement. He later buried the remains in a shallow grave in the backyard. Several weeks later, he dug up the remains and peeled the flesh from the bones. He dissolved the flesh in acid before flushing the solution down the toilet. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woodland behind the house. In January 1979, at his father's urging, Dahmer enlisted in the United States Army. Owing to Dahmer's alcohol abuse, his duties deteriorated, and in March 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for military service and was later discharged from the Army. On July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards escaped from the Milwaukee apartment of a man who'd handcuffed and threatened him. Police proceeded to the apartment to investigate. There, they found Jeffrey Dahmer and discovered a museum of horrors. Inside Dahmer's apartment were human remains, including severed heads, and he then confessed to committing 17 murders. Police corroborated Dahmer's gruesome crimes, and he was held for trial. At this time, Dahmer said it was a relief not to have any secrets anymore. However, instead of determining guilt or innocence, this killer would be judged on whether he'd be driven by insanity or had committed these incomprehensible acts as a sane man. On July 25th, 1991, Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22nd, he had been charged with a further 11 murders committed in Wisconsin. Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992. Attorneys at Dahmer's trial debated whether he suffered from either a mental or personality disorder. The prosecution claimed that any disorders did not deprive Dahmer of the ability to appreciate the criminality of his conduct, or to deprive him of the ability to resist his impulses. The defense argued that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease and was driven by obsessions and impulses he was unable to control. A large part of Dahmer's trial consisted of testimony from psychologists and psychiatrists regarding his mental state. Defense experts argued that Dahmer was insane due to his necrophilic drive, a compulsion to have sexual encounters with corpses. They testified that Dahmer was unable to control his conduct at the time due to alcohol dependence and a psychotic disorder. On January 13, 1992, Dahmer changed his plea to guilty with insanity. This removed the need for the criminal trial, meaning court proceedings would focus on Dahmer's sanity. The jury's decision would not need to be unanimous. Only 10 of 12 jurors would have to agree on Dahmer's mental state for a verdict to stand. Dahmer was described by the prosecution as a calculating and cunning individual, able to differentiate between right and wrong, with the ability to control his actions, and whose lust overpowered his sense of morality. The key witness to appear for the prosecution, a forensic psychiatrist, testified that he did not believe Dahmer had any form of mental disease or defect at the time that he committed the crimes. He explained that there was ample evidence that Dahmer prepared in advance for each murder. Therefore, his crimes were not impulsive. Two court-appointed mental health professionals testifying independently of either prosecution or defense stated that he killed those men because he wanted to kill the source of his homosexual attraction to them. They testified that it was a longing for companionship and love that caused Dahmer to kill, and testified that Dahmer was not psychotic. On February 14th, both attorneys delivered their closing arguments to the jury. Following the defense counsel's closing argument, the prosecution described Dahmer as a sane man in full control of his actions, who killed to control his victims and retained their bodies to give himself a prolonged period of sexual pleasure. On February 15th, Dahmer was ruled to be sane and not suffering from a mental disorder at the time of each of the 17 murders for which he was tried. After the verdict, Dahmer had the opportunity to speak. This was the first real time everyone heard from him. He said it was over now. He didn't ever want freedom. He wanted death for himself. He felt bad for what he did to those poor families, and he understood their rightful hate and that he had created a Holocaust. The judge sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life sentences, a total of 957 years. For the first year of his incarceration, Dahmer was placed in solitary confinement due to concerns for his physical safety should he come into contact with fellow inmates. In prison, Dahmer had requested that he had be given a copy of the Bible. This was granted, and Dahmer gradually devoted himself to Christianity and became a born-again Christian. Sorry, Jeffrey. Too little, too late. On November 28th, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. The inmate claimed Dahmer had been taunting fellow inmates with his cannibalistic infatuation. The killer claimed Dahmer did not yell or make any noise as he was being brutally beaten. On August 5th, 1991, a candlelit vigil to celebrate and heal the Milwaukee community was attended by more than 400 people. Present at the vigil were community leaders, gay rights activists, and family members of several of Dahmer's victims. Organizers stated the purpose of the vigil was to enable Milwaukeeans to share their feelings of pain and anger over what happened. Dahmer's murders were committed at a time of heightened race relations in the city. Dahmer's atrocities had exacerbated the racial tensions within the city. The black community and the gay community had been slaughtered by a dangerous killer who was looking for love, but in the worst way imaginable. Sane or insane? The judicial system will decide. Case closed. The courtroom is adjourned until the next argument is presented.